Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to this learning experience brought to you by Mend.io. My name is Cody, and I'd like to welcome you back to Techstrong Learning, where we have an exciting panel ahead. But before we get this panel rolling, I do have just a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review with everyone. First off, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion, perhaps you'd like to rewatch or share with your team, you will be receiving an email with a link to the on-demand recording shortly after we conclude this live session today. If you'd like to engage with us, which we highly encourage, we'd like you to use that chat tab on the right side of the screen. You'll notice there are a couple of messages in there already, but I'd like you to go ahead and let us know from where in the world you are joining us today. We have a global panel, and so we also assume we have a global audience, so feel free to chime in there. If you do have any specific questions, we do want you to send those to the Q&A tab, which is directly to the right of the chat tab. Sending your questions into the Q&A just helps us keep organized, and we want to answer as many of your questions as we can. So be sure to send in those questions early and often. Additionally, before we close things out today, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around for the duration of our conversation. Our topic today is AppSec Today Roundtable, Strange Bedfellows, Software, Security, and the Law. Leading our roundtable discussion is our very own Mitch Ashley, CTO of Techstrong Group and Principal of Techstrong Research. Mitch, I'll turn the floor over to you to introduce the rest of our panel.
Very good. Thank you very much, Cody J. Brown. Good to see you, sir. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our AppSec Today Roundtable. We've got a fantastic panel. I know I say that often, maybe always, but I really do mean it. Just getting on to this point, we've already had some great discussions, and I know that will continue into the roundtable. So first, I want to make sure that I thank our sponsors from Mend.io. Mend is a sponsor of of AppSec Today, part of Techstrong TV and our roundtable family of webinars that we do, that they co-collaborate with us on topics and ideas and guests and all kinds of things for this Techstrong show. So thank you to Maria and Carol and everyone at the Mend.io team for working with us. So I want to introduce our topic today, and I will do that right after I introduce our esteemed panel of guests. As I mentioned, we've got a good-sized panel. So I'm just going to kind of run down the list. If you all would all kind of raise hands, say hello. First, I want to call out Crystal Waisopo, who is founder, chief technology officer with Veracode, very much luminary in the industry. That many of us have known or maybe meeting for the first time today, but certainly very experienced, knowledgeable. Second of all, returning guest on the team today is Anthony Johnson. Anthony, you've seen on CISO Talk and some of our other programs today. He is a managing partner at Delve Risk. And we also have first-time guest, first-time caller is Chanel Chambers, who is head of marketing with Codem. Codem just came out of Stealth. And I'm sure you can find out a lot about that online. We're not talking about our products or our companies today, but please, there's probably some things you can learn online about Codem as well. And of course, a returning guest, he was with me at RSAC when we did a live panel, is Sam Quakenbush. Sam is Field Innovation and Strategy with Mend.io. Welcome to all of you. Glad to have you on the panel today.
Glad to be here.
Yeah.
Fantastic. We also have, oh, good, you're here. Michael just joined us. Michael Eisenberg. I'm sorry, Michael. Eisen, thank you. I didn't get a chance to ask you ahead of time. Michael is Principal Cybersecurity Counsel with MITRE. And one of the reasons we reached out and asked Michael to be on is he actually gave a fascinating talk at RSAC on this topic as well. So we are super pleased to have Michael here as well. Well, let's talk about our topic. I'm going to introduce it this way. The landscape of what CISOs, security people, CIOs, IT people as well, complexity of application security, software supply chain security. Add to that regulatory frameworks, what's happening both, in our respective countries as well as, across the globe. Litigation reaction. We'll talk a little bit about this governmental action taken against companies now that's happening where there have been security breaches around supply chain. And there's a lot of discussion, is the liability for software around vulnerabilities and security shifting. We all click the EULAs that we all sign. Larger companies tend to look at those a little bit more closely. But, is that liability truly changing? Is the shared risk model really truly shared, or does it really ultimately all come back to us? So I think a lot of us have talked about this before, and oftentimes it kind of comes back to, well, maybe it's the regulatory frameworks that are probably introducing some of the greatest change. You could argue whether it might be the hackers or other things. Chanel, I'm going to ask you to kind of kick things off. And Michael, just so you know, when we talked ahead of time, this is not Hub and Spoke with Mitch. Feel free to jump in as part of the conversation with everybody, and we'll call on each other as we go. So Chanel, if you want to jump in on our first question.
Yeah, I mean, I think regulation is obviously something that we all respond to, right? I mean, like a lot of times in business, the regulation is what sort of kickstarts everything. I think it's also really important to think about customers. At the end of the day, we all have products and services to support customers and the businesses that they are trying to run. So I think these regulations come from a sort of a good place of, let's watch out for the customers and the end users of our products. And sometimes I think the devil's in the details, right? When it comes to how do we actually make sure that we're looking out for customers in the right way? Is regulation always the right way? Maybe not. Is regulation sometimes the right thing? Probably, right? And it's just about drawing that balance. But I think what's really important in this thought and in this conversation is to really put customers in the center, because we're all customers at some point. We all consume SaaS software, open source software, and then we also sell it. And it's really important to have that basic trust that we're looking out for the people who are using and buying our products.
All right, I got to throw this out there.
Yeah.
I knew you were just waiting.
Yeah, I know he's waiting. He's like, yeah.
But so I think that the world we live in is different from the world we used to live in. What I mean by that is that regulators, politicians back in the day, when they were regulating a wheel size, they could understand the size and width of a wheel and the concept of that. Today, with technology and where we're at today, most of the regulators don't actually deeply understand what the hell they're regulating, right? And that creates a massive, massive problem. The best and brightest, I don't mean to offend anybody, and I'm a former military guy, but the best and brightest are typically not going to be in government. They're going to be in private industry. And we have organizations or in folks regulating things that they don't necessarily understand. It creates complexity for the industry and change, or challenges. And I think it's super, super messy. So let me shut up there really quick.
Yeah, so I wanted to jump in and just maybe talk a little bit up on customers, like Chanel was saying, because I think that's super important, because there's a huge range of sophistication of customers, right? Like there's government and military customers of software, which have big budgets to secure things. There's big corporations, Fortune 500, banks and regulated industries that are customers. And then there are, community hospitals and public school systems and small businesses. And they're all customers sometimes of the same software, right? And so if you're a sophisticated customer, maybe you know what you're getting into. Maybe you know not to trust the software. Maybe you have a budget for a team of people to wrap all kinds of security protection and detection and response, so you can actually run software that maybe is really vulnerable, and actually run your business pretty safely. Whereas someone who doesn't have that sophistication or budget to wrap security technology around vulnerable software, they could actually lose their entire operations. We just saw a hospital shut down because of ransomware, and they couldn't they couldn't run their billing for a few months, and they just ran out of money. They couldn't pay anyone, they couldn't buy supplies, and they had to shut down. So it's interesting to think about the capabilities of the customer really matter. And so do we want to protect those customers that have no capabilities of actually running in secure software, when we know that there are organizations that are capable of running in secure software and surviving?
Here's the example I think where this is concerning for me is that I agree with you. Like there are a lot of unsophisticated customers who can't do it themselves. So I think, the idea of like, you build it, we just provide the infrastructure has its limits. But now we have regulators effectively coming into the mix saying, well, any new product needs to be fully interoperable between all the cloud vendors. Okay, what startup is going to say, hey, I'm going to build this thing that does this in AWS and simultaneously solves it in Azure and then simultaneously solves it in GCP, right? Because they all don't work the same way. And that regulatory approach, in my view, is a huge risk to innovation. Sure, they want to make it easy for the end customer, but good night to anyone trying to build a startup. Who's going to fund that? Like, that's wild to me.
Yeah,
I think one of the problems that we've got is a mismatch between the expectations and the understanding of the process, the regulatory process, and the societal framework and the economic framework on the one hand, and the astonishing speed of innovation on the technology side. And the story, I think I heard someone talking about railroad gauges earlier. We've had a regulatory scheme in this country around products that have some inherent risk, like trains, planes, and automobiles, for more than 100 years. And we've learned how to adapt a regulatory process to try and protect the public interest, convenience, and necessity. But I will dispute for a minute the issue of the expertise of the agencies. There are a lot of really smart people in the agencies, and I am affiliated with an institution that has 6,000 PhD computer scientists and engineers doing nothing but supporting federal agencies on the bleeding edge technology issues. So I'm not so certain that the issue is the absence of expertise, but it is fundamentally a mismatch of processes. We know how to innovate at breathtakingly fast speeds. What we don't know how to do is regulate at appropriate speeds with appropriate checks and balances and bells and whistles of control to make sure that we don't hobble the economics of the innovation. The debate going around on AI right now is a perfect example of that, where the entrepreneurs are front running the community with incredible innovation, but the risks are only now beginning to be understood. And the power of the technology is so overwhelming that you get sometimes hyperbolic statements like this may be an existential threat to society. It may be. We may not be around to understand it if that happens. The machines may get out in front of us before we even appreciate their capacities. But that quandary is typical of what has gone on in software, in microelectronics, in network architecture, in every innovation in the ICT space in the 50 years that I've been involved with it, but really with the evolution of industrial technology from, as I said, more than 100 years. We have a system. We don't, I believe, really understand how to adapt to that system. And right now, and I think one of the reasons I'm here is right now that legal and regulatory system is beginning to come up with some tentative innovations that are going to change the game around the way we contract for and deploy technology in a new definition of what constitutes due diligence. Every one of these transactions is governed by a contract or a statute and a contract under that statute in the government spaces. And the nature of that contracting is changing dramatically to push burdens onto both the developers and sellers, as well as the old classic caveat emptor burden on the buyer to beware of what they're getting because they might be buying a pig in a poke. But back to my original point, I think we've got a mismatch, and one of our challenges is to get that mismatch more into sync between the innovation and the expectations on the economic side.
I think our fallback, Michael, maybe was we can blame Congress and not the regulators. Is that since they're got a low
Had a
rating?
functioning Congress, I guess we could blame them, but right now I don't believe it.
I'm being sarcastic, of course.
It is a huge issue. Like, I mean, like, and I'll give you an example. When I was a CISO at JP Morgan, my auditor for the Fed, 2 weeks before sitting down with us, was the manager at a McDonald's chain. Right? Like, it was fascinating that like, we were having to justify a cybersecurity strategy, how we thought about application security, how we apply frameworks, right, to somebody who had been in IT for all of 2 weeks, and and that's the challenge. Like, that is a huge issue.
I hear you. I think it is a challenge, but honestly, like, what the regulators really should be focusing on the outcomes of the issue. So like, it really doesn't matter. Like, I don't think you need to be for example, the railroad example you used, you don't need to be an expert in rails, rail or in trains to know that a train could kill someone if someone is on the track when the train goes down the track, right? And therefore, we now have regulations around the arms that come down and the horn, the decibels of the train horn and things like that. So like, I actually think that whether or not someone has IT experience is kind of irrelevant when it comes to the regulatory part of it. If you define regulation as managing outcomes, like, we don't want someone to get hit by a train, right? So how do we make it so people don't get hit by a train? I don't need to know anything about making trains to know that I want to keep the public safe. And so therefore I can say, hey, we need a whistle. Now, I'm not telling you where to put the whistle or how loud. Well, maybe I am saying how loud the whistle needs to be, but like, I think there is a balance between managing outcomes of public safety, public health, whatever it happens to be, and the how. So the what is regulating the outcome, but the how is what you're talking about, I think, Anthony, which is that's where you actually do need like technical expertise to figure out how to implement it. But the outcome is we want people to be safe.
I'm curious, Anthony, Michael, you mentioned about the shifting the liability, responsibility, and contracts and agreements, and thus regulation. Can you put some more meat on the bone about what is changing in what areas and how quickly that's happening?
Well, the first instances of the modern view of due diligence, I think, come from the lemon laws in the used car industry in the 1950s and 60s, where all of a sudden the concept of warranty started applying in places where the buyer beware was the most brazenly obvious. A used car salesman is a cliche in American culture, a way of defining an inherently dishonest person. The industry was felt to be dishonest, but then the state of New Jersey passed a lemon law statute and said, if a used car seller sells you a product and you can't repair it with 3 tries, you get to give the car back to the dealer. And that was the first instance of state level regulation of contracts that added new meat to the bones of due diligence and shifted the 2+ 100-year-old notion of buyer beware, caveat emptor, with the risk largely falling on the buyer, with the seller pretty much having impunity. And over the decades, that has changed dramatically. The concept of warranties has become more and more specific and granular. Warranties have been incorporated in the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, and the DFAR, the Defense Acquisition Regulations, and all the state acquisition regulations that mirror them, so that now the contracts that we do for IT at every level of government reflect a general acceptance in society that there are some things that the buyer doesn't necessarily have the expertise to be fully informed on, and some of the risk ought to shift to the seller. That statutory shift in the federal contracting space has now begun to bleed over very specifically into defining the elements of trustworthiness in contractual transactions in the broader commercial marketplace, so that concepts of disclosure and candor and illumination of the pedigree and provenance of your software, concepts of things like bills of materials being required as elements of software contracts. It's not part of the statutory scheme yet. BOMs are mentioned in this year's White House Cybersecurity Strategy as an option, but we don't have an act of Congress or a regulation requiring it yet. And maybe sometime there are lots of schools of thought about what SBOMs and bombs should look like and how much rigor we should attach to enforcing them. But what is evolving is a new sense of a much more balanced relationship between the buyer and the seller, especially with sophisticated products, especially in sensitive environments like critical infrastructures and national security environments. There's much more tolerance of spreading the pain so that all the burden doesn't fall on the buyer to have a crystal ball and imagine what this innovative new software, perhaps heretofore never really tried in the same kind of context as the buyer is proposing to do. What exactly is the seller's responsibility there? Increasingly, we're seeing efforts to make sure that there's explicit language where the buyer is expected to know about their own supply chain and to candidly, or rather the seller is expected to know about their own supply chain and candidly disclose that to the buyer, just as the buyer has the burden of explaining to a seller how he intends to use the product, what the context is and what some of the risks are. So the seller has the opportunity to say, wait a minute, we didn't develop this product for those purposes. You're using it in a way that's inappropriate. It's much greater risk. We'll sell it to you, but only with the disclaimer that you're fully transparently understanding that there's a high risk here and we're not warranting that it's going to work for you. Those kinds of much more open, candid transactions, especially in large spaces. When the intelligence community bought AWS from Amazon as its primary network for moving intelligence data, the contract is 900 pages. I mean, there's a lot of language in there to try and make sure that all of the T's were dotted and I's were crossed, as the facetious ones like to say, because there's just so much new context and to these kinds of situations. But the bottom line is it's a shifting of the balance from all the risk on the side of the buyer to much more shared risk and responsibility, including in contract terms on the seller. And that's going to be reflected in FARs and DFARs and state acquisition regulations supporting contracting. And it's going to eventually, I would argue, bleed out 50 years from now. A more balanced due diligence, I will argue, will be part of the contracting environment everywhere, not just in ICT, not just in sophisticated.
Hey, Michael, there's a lot in there. I want to jump in on one part. You talked about bombs a little while back, right? And you know how the regulations are saying you have to give this list, right? But we're putting the onus on the buyer, not on the seller, right? That was one of the points you made. That's like, food, right? There's an ingredients list, but does everyone actually look at what's in your food? No, we all go out to eat all the time, and we never look at the ingredients list.
But interesting, that's changing too. There's a real move on in the U.S. to mirror what's happening in Latin America and Europe, to put those food nutrition labels now on the front of boxes, and even to color code those that have extra added sugar and are not nutritionally wholesome. So while we may not be paying a lot of attention to the micro print on the side or the back of the box, increasingly the nutrition community is saying it ought to be on the front. Well, in IT, it's a similar situation. In the old days, the burden was all on the buyer. But now we're saying, because of the inherent risk, because of the increasing complexity, because you do have front-running software and microelectronics vendors who are developing fabulous innovations that may have never been used in that context, there ought to be some shared responsibility in the contractual relationship.
I'd respectfully disagree. I'm not going to lie. I can eat a little bit of sugar and I don't die. But guess what? If a Log4j situation happens, somebody gets fired.
Well, talk to the people fired from Birdseye or General Foods for not providing candid information in their lab development of new products in the food industry. It's happened. It's not just in IT. There is a growing sense of responsibility in Western culture that if you're putting a product in front of a consumer, you have some burden of responsibility for its safety and wholesomeness.
So let's do this, Michael. Let me jump in here. What I'd like to do is let's talk about the utility of SBOMs, right? Because it's obviously getting a lot of attention. It's one of the first things that everybody is focusing on, and there is some presidential orders, et cetera, around SBOMs. What's the true utility of that? It's certainly doesn't solve the whole supply chain issue, but I think you raised a good point, Sam, is that it puts the onus on the buyer. Just like, what am I going to do with that, right? Do I just say, thank you, it's very good? What happens when that's changing in a SaaS environment where that SBOM could change 3-4 times a day, right?
I think there's utility to SBOMs even if the consumer doesn't get the SBOM. If the consumer, if the vendor is required to have an SBOM that they keep themselves, or maybe the consumer can ask for it and then they can say, oh, well, I have it, but I'm not going to give it to you. Or yeah, here it is for some consumers. The fact that vendors have SBOMs is the most important part, right? Because then when you ask a question of the vendor, you say, are you using Log4j in this product? There's an instant response. They're not running around trying to figure out, are they using this library and where are they using it and which version is it? They're managing their own risk. And I want to know that a vendor is managing their supply chain risk. And a good way to say that is if I asked you for an SBOM, because I'm just spot checking, I'm not keeping my own repository of SBOMs of everything and trying to manage all of my SBOMs of all the software. But I want to be able to ask a vendor, do you have the SBOM? And I want them to produce it for me. That gives me a lot of information that they know what's in their software. And if they know they're running vulnerable open source software in there, they're going to have to disclose it at that point because I'm asking them for their SBOM. So I don't want to manage SBOMs
I think it's a mistake to put
but I want them to be available to me.
Agreed.
I think it's a mistake to put undue attention on SBOMs. They are one tool, one element of an overall landscape that's evolving around trustworthiness, around transparency and disclosure being migrated to more and more towards the producer. And there'll be an equilibrium established between what the seller is entitled to understand about the buyer's intended use, especially in these sophisticated environments I described, and the buyer's ability to use data, not just the bill of materials data, but other data about pedigree and provenance. Where did that software code come from? Well, how many different layers of history are there in this cell library? How much of it came from an adversarial nation, buried 20 transactions and 2 decades back in the dim mists of early developmental history? Those elements of transparency are important to some folks, unimportant to others. But the BOM is a snapshot in real time of current practice. I think it's going to be useful. I think it'll find a lot of adherence, but it's not the panacea to what we're talking about.
I think if
trust problem.
If we don't go, if we aren't careful though, what we're going to end up with is effectively an expectation that buyers maintain the equivalent of government certification and accreditation packaging. Mm-hmm. It's a completely unrealistic and untenable position to be in, right? I think sellers,
some very large buyers, and especially buyers of developmental tools, would argue that's exactly what they do. The Microsoft or Apple development groups, I'm sure, feel exactly.
Well, I would argue that, so they're sellers. So, like I say, so they should know what's in their tools and. Got it, right? But as a buyer, I should know that the thing I'm getting, it's safe, and it's the SBOM conversation. I agree with Chris, right? Like, I want to be able to get to it when I want to get to it. We as consumers, as buyers in general in tech, we don't. I would argue that we don't necessarily respond to risk. Everyone's like, oh, we responded to Log4j. People responded to that because it was a crisis, right? It became a thing, and then suddenly, then they were like, oh, we're managing it because of the risk. And the greatest example I can use is this. Every year we have the top 100 worst passwords in the world that come out, that list, right? Everyone laughs about it. Oh, who's using password 123, etc. Why is it that application product vendors don't just hard code prohibit those passwords in their application? Hey, a user entered this, we just block the hash. You're not allowed to do that as a password. Because as buyers,
it's actually in the NIST guideline now is known bad passwords need to be screened for in a password system. No one does it, but that's actually in the NIST password best management practices, it's there.
Every
And
financial
buyers do
service
ask
company
for it.
I ever deal with now has a flag on password saying your password is a familiar one, easy to guess. Would you like to change it now? I
Yep.
get that flag all the time.
Well, we check it on the password component, but I'm saying actually in the application of itself, we historically haven't asked for that, and so the product creators haven't built it in because it's not a hard thing to do. I mean, we're in 2023 and we're just not like, oh yeah, we should like.
Well, I think
We
this is a good
historically
point,
didn't have
Anthony.
software warranties either, but now some software developers are saying if it doesn't work in your environment, we'll work with you to fix it.
But I think this is a good point you're making, Anthony. It's in the NIST guidance. It's there. It's known. Michael says some banks are doing it, but do we want to regulate that and say, hey, if you take passwords, you have to scan for these. It's in the NIST guidance. You have to follow the NIST guidance. If you are a software vendor, you have to do it. That's what we're talking about here today is regulation, not the fact that some intelligent and sophisticated companies follow the NIST guidance or
Exactly.
that NIST guidance is good. Are we going to make everyone do it? That's what we're talking about. So what do people think?
I think it's a good question because I was thinking back to the Sam example, and one of the participants commented about is a food label comparison to Log4j. And I think it is because we don't live in a world of security where every action we take is to run everything down to the nth degree to make sure that it's safe, secure, et cetera, right? There's still trust built in. We use the NIST framework. Okay, well, do you really? Okay, we are attesting that we do. Maybe we have a third party attest to it, et cetera. So we may do things to validate that we are following certain processes and procedures. But I don't imagine a day where, at least in the near term, every consumer of software is going to run down every version of the SBOM and then chase those to the nth degree of its neural network.
All you need is one consumer to do it, and if they were regulated, that consumer can say, "Hey, I'm gonna raise an issue," and that all you need is one consumer when the regulations are there.
One consumer, or I'd put it into a database and say, "Is there anything in here I should be concerned about? Tell me if there's something."
I'm going to throw that hand grenade now, though, right? Like the one I talked about earlier, right? Like I fund, and this is not just Anthony, former CISO, thinking this. This is conversations this week with sitting Fortune 100 CISOs who collectively we've said that we believe that regulators are a bigger risk than hackers at this point, right? Companies, if they get breached, and I had this conversation with I love Uber. When they had their event, I don't know a single person who actually stopped using Uber, right? Like not one. What am I going to do? Use Lyft? Like that's not a real thing. I'm using Uber, right? And I think out of every breach, there's only been one or two companies where in 9 months the stock hasn't more than recovered, right? Like the consumers fundamentally, like how many of these things do we get? So
yeah, but wait a second. If Uber wasn't held accountable, every single CISO would now say, every time I'm breached, I can pay ransoms with my bug bounty program and hide it from regulators, right? Like if it wasn't enforced, things would get much worse.
Well,
right?
That's where we get to the Wells notice that we were talking about, right? It's a really fascinating piece, and particularly if you in the details of that case. But like the reality is that even NIST and CISA talk about, hey, this is the process if you pay a ransomware, right? Like ransomware is a big business. I know of a couple companies last year that paid $24 million ransoms, large organizations, right? Like it is a fascinating big business that's happening. But when regulators start to say, you know what, we're going to fine and punish you for getting hacked, it feels like victim blaming in at scale that's just been acceptable. And then we find a reason why they were negligent. And there's a difference between being really negligent and not knowing that somebody was going to look at this one thing and do it sideways and stand on their head and cartwheel into your house. Like
this is where the insurance industry is going to intervene, because there's an epidemic of businesses falsely disclosing the extent of their cybersecurity measures, and then when they make a claim falsely saying that they had measures in place. And the insurance industry is going to be mediating that and start cutting people off from insurance and start denying claims and start prosecuting people for fraud,
The
saying they had cybersecurity that they don't have.
I think it was Zurich in January. The CEO said that he believes cyber is uninsurable. Like, that's fascinating, right?
So I have a question about, so here's my experience with regulatory, very limited in terms of any direct involvement, but when I spent several years in the telecom space, and it has its own weirdities and oddities, et cetera. But very, very clearly, there's paid influence. People are influencing regulators, right? That are part of those organizations. And I don't mean inappropriately. I'm not trying to say that. But, as Michael mentioned, there are experts that are being relied upon, third party outside. There's also people from those companies, whether they're coming from, the advocacy parts of the business or maybe also technical as well. It seems to me we're in this phase of, well, what do we do about software supply chain security? What do we do about application security? And how those disclosures are performed and how we validate that we say we're doing what we're doing. And oftentimes policies and companies come down because we have a new expense report policy because somebody spent too much on an airline ticket, right? It's the exception that drives a lot of the policy. It's the Log4j, it's the SolarWinds. And I'm kind of worried that we're in the space of the next, thing that jumps out at us will drive the next GDRP or whatever regulation it might be. Maybe that's a non-optimistic view of the world or skeptic view.
Oh, that's total reality. Like experts making predictions with statistical models and all things can be absolutely correct, but until the actual thing happens, the change doesn't happen. But we're having those events happen all the time.
And
that's a good point. Yeah.
In the media environment we have today, all it takes is one black swan event to completely change the nature of an industry. I guarantee you that the submersibles industry will never be the same again because of the media hype around Titan.
One thing will be the same is I won't be on one, but that's a different.
It's interesting that you bring that up because, the CEO, this was in the news, had said something about safety being a waste, quote unquote. Like, I think that was his word. And, I think we understand what he means, like the spirit of what he means, like statistically, certain things won't happen. But I will say that from a customer point of view, it sounds bad, right? When you're basically saying, hey, there's a lot of overhead to safety or risk management or whatever you want to call it. So therefore we shouldn't do it. Now, he didn't say that exactly, but when we start talking about things like, regulation is worse than the hackers or something like that, I feel like that starts to sound a little bit like we as an industry don't care about regulation. And it's fine to talk about it sort of in the context of a larger conversation. But when something really, a black swan event happens, something really bad happens, and some tech CEO is on the New York Times saying, safety regulation, it's just a waste, right? And then there are dead people or something really bad happens. It's almost like, okay, what do we do? It's a bad look, number one. Number two, it seems a little bit irresponsible to say, yeah, we know that things happen, but statistically it's so negligible that we shouldn't care about it. Like, I do think that as responsible corporate citizens and as responsible people, that we should have some sort of answer to these black swan events, especially because these black swan events, have such huge impacts, right? People die depending on what kind of software it is. So I do think that the submersible tragedy is a little bit of a teachable moment here, because the risk is huge, even though the probability of something happening is very small.
And that's a tough lesson to learn. But I would argue that the largest and most successful players in our sector saw safety and security as a cost initially, as it always is. But then when over time, when you realize the benefits competitively of having safety and security that your competitors don't have, you reap the benefits of it, and it may become a standard and everyone else has to catch up with you. But it certainly affords large companies that pay attention to safety and security an advantage once they ingest the cost and understand it as not just an expense that they wish they didn't have, but potentially a benefit. It's migrating that understanding that is at the heart of this trustworthiness discussion, and I would argue the evolution of the new due.
So I have this talk that I do where we mapped Maslow's hierarchy of needs to businesses and particularly cybersecurity, right? And when you look at it from that context, revenue being the core aspects of food, air, water, right? Security is not the core. It's not the fundamental necessity for survival. And businesses are in a survival mode. Great organizations, large organizations, they have the luxury of ascending up to self-actualization, right? And kind of going through that. And it's a really fun conversation to have with folk. But when you realize, hey, security is kind of like a few layers up, you're like, oh, it's a luxury of successful companies, right? Security fundamentally is a luxury, and it's a nice to have, because if we were in a zombie apocalyptic world, we would be out fighting for food and survival to live past the zombies. And safety is important after we've met our core needs. And in business, that's revenue.
Yeah, you can actually model that. You can actually look at things like technical debt, which is a requirement of a startup, of a new technology company. You have to take on technical debt to get 100%. To that point where you actually start getting someone to pay for your software. If you can't get to that point, you're not going anywhere. And then maybe you manage it a little bit better, but you still take it on till you get to the point where you're profitable, because or you get someone to buy you and inherit your debt. I think you can think of the same thing with security debt, with safety debt. It's another form of technical debt that you need to take on, or you're never going to get there. So this is the core of the innovation problem, right? Because we all know innovation happens more at startup companies and new companies that are able to take on this technical debt, security debt, safety debt, whatever you want to call it. And that has to be solved with this regulatory framework, because otherwise,
But that's the challenge for successful companies. The challenge for successful companies and where they've succeeded is often being able to characterize what to others is simply a cost. They're able to characterize it as a feature and a benefit and a differentiator that makes them successful in the marketplace.
Question for you. It's interesting that I've heard more often in the last 3 months security debt, like we've heard technical debt in the software world. I want to direct the conversation towards what's next after SBOMs. We sort of had the debate about the value, and it's not the be all to end all, but what is next? It may not be the next one thing, but what is it? Okay, so we're doing SBOMs, we're getting those from our vendors, we're creating them for our software, we're maybe doing something with it, we're doing software decomposition, we're using technologies that help us manage security risks to that. What's beyond that? What are the next set of 2 or 3 things that people in our audience, if they're not already doing, could look at? Do you want to jump in, Chris? You're living this with
I threw in the
CTO. I'm going to jump to you.
Yeah, I threw in the SSDF or SDLC attestation that was something that came out of Biden's cybersecurity executive order 2 years ago, and is now getting to the point where it's in draft mode by CISA. And basically, it's a subset of NIST's secure software development framework, which is all these activities that you can do to end up with more reliable, more secure software. Things like doing static analysis to find vulnerabilities, doing things like using the right compiler settings so that you're protecting against buffer overflows, like all these things that you can do, processes that you can do, and decisions you can make while you're building the software to end up with a more secure software. Now, some companies will just do this automatically because they're mature, they're sophisticated. They've built this process because they don't want to be patching a lot of things, like think about a Microsoft or something like that. They're already doing all of these things. And there are startups that are completely unaware of any of these activities, right? And they're not doing any of them. So there's a huge range out there in software development. And so what the attestation form is the customer can say, what are these activities you are doing? And this helps me understand the risk in your software. So like if SBOM is like, what ingredients did you use? And how bad are those ingredients? Helps me manage the risks of what I'm purchasing. The SSDF is saying it's not just the ingredients, but it's how you're testing to make sure they're pure, and you're configuring those things. And so that's something that the federal government is going to be asking its suppliers to say, how did you build the software? Tell me, give me that list of activities you did, map them to the SSDF. That is something that regulators could say, hey, a vendor has to deliver that with their software. Like an ingredients label, they have to have sort of a process label too. And I think that's
self-attestation though, right?
It's self-attestation, yeah.
I have to full disclose. I'm on the board of directors for the CMMC, for Cyber AB, or regulating oversight side of the CMMC standard, which is really, really fascinating, and some supply chain components there. I think it is interesting, though, going back to your point earlier, Chris, like where does the onus ultimately sit, right? Like if I'm in my kitchen and I have 5 different ingredients, I should be able to go and be like, okay, how was this sugar made? Whatever it is, right? Like what's actually in it? Is it actually sugar, right? But it's impossible for there to be any expectation on the supplier to know how I'm going to use that sugar, right? And I think that's where it gets into the core aspect of like, what are we actually trying to measure, monitor? Because when we get back to the conversation of application security, vulnerability, reporting an incident, right? Like it gets to be really, really weird. I remember having a conversation with a large regulator because they wanted to see all of our vulnerabilities. And I'm like, it was the most insane conversation of like, you want us, and they wanted to see every attack that was hitting us and I'm like, so you want to see every port scan, every, like this is what you want here, right? Because they didn't understand what they were asking for. And so this comes back to that in order to have oversight and even be an auditor, you have to have the deep technical understanding, because technology today has so many nuances, right? There are regulators and folks that are passing policy that don't actually know what agile is, and they don't know how that kind of functions or changes the build life cycle. And these all impact the security components within any sort of product or service that we use.
Anthony, I think you're conflating the fairly pedestrian expectations of a consumer of sugar with the much different level of expectation of usability and fitness for use in a sophisticated government environment. And I think the attestations will become valuable, not just because they're being prepared, but because they're going to be asked for. That's the evolution that's happening.
Well, as the buyer of a product, I know 100%. I'm with you on that. But if I'm buying, and I'm using this as an example, and I'm buying an Ocean to host my cloud components, which I'm not, to be really, really clear, right? Like it's impossible for that provider of the solution to know for what purposes I'm going to be using that.
But that's what's going to be part of due diligence, is an engagement where that understanding can be reached on a case-by-case basis, and the boundaries of that engagement and discussion that are not currently defined in the FAR, the DFARs, or other acquisition rules, or in contracting generally, that's going to evolve over years and decades to become SOP. And we're not there now. And I agree that it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. But what is definitely emerging is that things like the attestation, like the anecdotal example of SBOMs, are eventually going to become part of the fabric.
Yeah, it's. I think you're right. It's, all due respect, it's hard to imagine having that conversation with all my suppliers and then doing it with all their customers. But so there's got to be some methods to get us between here and there. I know you're talking kind of forward. So I want to throw one thing out here. We're coming up on our time here, and we have some gift cards to give away that Cody's going to join in on at the end of the session. So hang out another 12 minutes or so. So I'm going to throw the AI bomb into the conversation. And are there
We couldn't
any
get through it, could we, Mitch? We
I
had to
know.
bring up AI.
I am shocked none of you did it, because usually I start the timer and see who says it first. So I'm the guilty party on this. Is there anything in software security and AI that either on the regulatory front, I know it's very early, or what vendors, what technologies or creators are doing that we see are going to make some meaningful differences in the next 2 years or less? Thoughts on that? I'll open it up to so everybody's using their crystal ball, so all answers are wrong and right at the same time, because
say the question. Repeat the question, Mitch.
Do you foresee AI helping us with software supply chain security, and in what ways in the next 2 years? Relatively short period of time.
But then I'd
Where do
give
you
away
see
my
people
startup
working on
idea,
interesting
Mitch.
things?
Come on.
Sorry, Sam, go ahead.
I would give away my startup idea. I mean, this is my claim to fame in the next year or two.
We are recording.
Well, what is coming in the next year or two is more aggressive regulation at the national level. The EU has just gone through step one of a 3-step process of passing a national AI statute. The UK is working on one. We're having hearings in the Senate. The ABA just in February issued a statement of principles around AI, which includes some issues about the use of AI in software development. So I think it's coming.
I don't want to be pessimistic. I feel like I'm being pessimistic this whole thing, and I'm not trying to be. Right?
You eat the wrong box of Wheaties today, Anthony.
I know. So I think the problem that we're going to face is that you can't actually have a conversation with two people and get the same definition of what AI is. And when you can't even understand what the definition of it is, it's almost impossible to regulate it. And so we end up, and startup vendors are actually just as bad, because AI popped up and everyone's like, oh yeah, we do that too. It's like, oh, you've just incidentally been doing AI for the last 4 years and as well. And it's like, yeah, see this thing, we have a spreadsheet that does a thing, that's AI. And like, that's not right. So I think that we have to define what AI actually is, which goes back to my point of like, we have to have on all sides deeply technical people to know what the heck they're talking about. So
NIST, we're bringing up NIST several times here because they're great with standards, right? It's right in their name. Has come up with the AI risk management framework. So we at least there's a framework out there that we can start to talk about where risk is managed when you're building AI. And so I think we can start to ask questions of, did you do these activities? And when I look, we have an AI product at Veracode, and so I've gone through the process of building one, and our customers are asking us, how do I know this is safe? How do I know this and that about it? How do I know it's not using my data to give to another customer? Things like that, and you can start to have transparency in these regulations around like, what was your training data set, right? Was it Reddit, or was it Webster's dictionary? Because those are vastly different things, right? And then like, was it supervised learning or was it unsupervised learning? How did you do alignment on the output to see that it's actually giving right answers? Because I can tell you right now, ChatGPT definitely does not give the right answer all the time. But like what we're doing, which is producing a patch for a vulnerability, you better be given the right answer. So I can answer questions to my customers. And so I don't know why we couldn't have some regulations around AI where you can disclose these very simple things like what was your training set and things like that. Although people won't want to do that because it's proprietary, right?
I'm going to just jump in on this. My thinking about this right now is there's the application of it and what the implications of that are, all the way to the AI apocalypse, if you want to go that far with it. It seems to me the core of it is, yeah, it's AI and algorithms, et cetera, but it's about the data. Is what data are you using? To your point, Chris, what data is your product or technology trained on, and what are the sources of that? Because I think we're to differentiate between everyone else who's putting generative AI, ChatGPT kind of feature in their UI to answer via query language into their database, et cetera. A good standard application. To the other extreme of I'm a SaaS and I collect a lot of data that I anonymize to train models, and that data is something that's not available to a lot of other people.
Yeah.
But I don't really want to disclose too much about it or give away
Right.
too much of my
So
secret
it's the market. It's the market now. Like we made a decision to have a curated data set. Stable Diffusion has all these people making sure there's no pornography images going into their data set, because that's a business decision they made, right? They want it to feel safe that a child could generate an image and not get pornography. So right now it's the market, and some people are doing it, and some making safety, and some aren't. But the question is, like, will regulators force it to be safe?
Sam, are you going to tell us your startup idea yet?
At least in some domains, I think that's inevitable. I mean, we've already had instances of lawyers filing briefs with synthetic case citations that are whole cloth. They look like a citation, but they don't exist. We've had ChatGPT taking the New York bar exam and passing it. There are situations in critical infrastructures, in national security sensitive environments, where you have to be able to have some kind of transparency into the process of the algorithm, how the prompting works, what the qualifications of the prompter are. Goes back to your fresh out of McDonald's employee. Who do you want prompting AI? Someone who is an expert in the field, or someone who's just filling a chair?
But if we heavily regulate it in the U.S., and I think that we run the serious risk of stifling innovation from early stage small organizations coming up, right? And foreign countries are not going to have those same limitations on their innovation. And I think it's going to be very, very interesting both from a national security perspective. I mean, 50% of U.S. GDP is the SMB. We often talk about large enterprises, right? There's a high castle wall. It's a very nice white glove set of problems to have some of the cyber stuff that, I dealt with at JP Morgan or Fannie Mae. But the SMB, the small organizations, like if they come up with a cool way to do this thing, and there's heavy-handed regulation because it was created by folks who don't deeply understand it, like that's a massive, massive impact and ripple on where we're going.
So we're just about at the end here. I want to give both, how about Chanel, and then Sam will give you the last thought. 1 minute each, if you would, please, and then we'll give away some gift cards.
Yeah, I think for me, the last thought is about the outcome that we're trying to avoid, right? So the extreme case is we don't want people to die because of what we've done or some really bad situation, right? And I think we all can agree that like bad outcomes or catastrophic outcomes are not something that we want. I think the level of regulation that requires, a decent amount of safety is definitely debatable, right? That's what we've been talking about. But I think the most important thing is to focus on the outcomes that we're trying to drive, and not so much like government. To Anthony's point, people don't all have the same backgrounds and the same expertise, but we all should be thinking about how can we ensure an outcome that is not going to be catastrophic, and use whatever capabilities we have and whatever expertise we have to think about ways within our own domains to keep that from happening.
All right. Thank you very much. Sam?
I love that. Focus on the outcome. Like if you think about regulation, what it does is it triggers people to start thinking about and doing things. Going back to the food ingredients, just because the list of ingredients is on a label doesn't mean we're all going to be healthy. But looking at that label and thinking about it causes you to go, I need to eat healthy. I need to work out more. Applying that to cybersecurity and SBOM, you start thinking about your security program and doing better things. Not because they're regulating you to, but they're adding a little bit of regulation that makes you think about it and deal with the outcome.
It does bring attention to some things, doesn't it, Sam? Very good point. Well, with that, we're going to wrap things up. I want to announce our gift card winners. Our 4 winners are Aaron K, Emily M, Savas K, and let's see, Adele Eason. I'm not sure this person's name. Anyway, all 4 of you will get reached out from Cody or one of the members of our team to about how to receive those I want to do a shout out to Mend.io for being our sponsor of this forum, of our roundtable today, AppSec today. Fantastic partner to work with, and Sam, a superb representative of the team there. Also want to thank our panelists. Chris, it's great to be on a first panel with you, as well with you, Michael, and Chanel. First time I've had an opportunity to work with you. And of course, Anthony, my old pal and bud, good to have you back again. And you are always thinking outside of the curve, and that's one of the great values of many others to have you here. So thank you very much for being here, and I appreciate the diverse conversation, very different perspectives we brought from marketing to tech to regulatory to living in the world of thought leadership and working with customers. So thank you especially to our audience. We had a lot of great comments. And some questions come in through the chat today, and really helped drive our conversation as well. So we'll hope that you will join us again for the next AppSec Today conversation, as well as other great programming happening on Techstrong Learning. You can check us out at DevOps.com, Security Boulevard, Techstrong AI, as well as the other one, the Security Boulevard. Thank you. DevOps.com. All right. It's been a long panel here. We're going to let folks go. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again on our next live roundtable. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Mitch.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye.